You're listening to Up1Notch, a podcast where I explore the tech business world. My name is Mohammad Aoun, and I'm a growth accelerator for tech companies looking to scale their businesses. I'm sitting down with software industry leaders, startup founders, and tech experts. Tune in to hear about the latest and greatest from the tech world. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Up1Notch, where we talk to different people from the tech space. Today, my guest is Jeannette Fackler. Hi, Jeannette. How are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I know you're nearing your promotion already, so things must be busy.
Yes, quite a bit. We're transitioning to the new role, so have one foot in each bucket, so to speak, for a while.
Awesome. Okay. So for the audience, can you just introduce yourself and talk a little bit more about Lumen Technology, big company, but I would let you kind of introduce about the company as well, and then we can take it forward from there.
Sure. Yep. So I am a client strategist in the SLED sector, which means state and local government and higher education. I work at Lumen Technologies, and we are a provider traditionally of network infrastructure, telephony, unified communications, etc. But our company's strategy and go forward initiative is also to start providing a lot of managed services in both the infrastructure as well as IT services and security services. So my job is mostly helping our clients and our sales teams to focus on what their strategy is going to be for the coming years.
Right. So for a company, like, we're not talking about like for a small and medium enterprise, if we're talking about the local government and the state and everything. So a typical project with these type of entities, how does that really progress? Like from the point of like when you're defining the strategy all the way to kind of implementation of different technologies and everything, what's a typical life cycle look like for these projects?
So state governments and to some extent local governments have a lot of restrictions and constraints around procurement, right? They have a lot of legislation around how they have to procure. So a lot of times what we see in the IT and infrastructure groups is that they'll spend years, even while they're implementing certain infrastructure, they're looking at the next steps for them because they know it takes time, right? So we will hope, preferably be consulting with them and having conversations about what are those upcoming infrastructure trends, get them thinking about, is that a direction that could help them in the future, right? And then, but typically you're looking at 5-year contracts, right? And implementations tend to be quite lengthy, right? So often those 5-year contracts will turn into 7 or 10-year contracts. So it takes governments time to implement new technologies, and that means they want to be careful and make sure that they are taking the right steps and going with the right providers.
Right. And I take that the process goes through that typical RFI and RFP kind of process where they kind of publish different tenders and kind of ask for quotations and proposals from different organizations like Lumen Tech and select a partner for the project.
Yes, absolutely. So states, sometimes will have sort of collaborative contracts that multiple vendors are on, and they can choose to purchase off of there. But often if it's over a certain procurement amount, they must go and submit RFPs or requests for proposal in order to procure a new service. Local governments have fewer constraints, but a lot of times they do choose to go to RFP because they want to receive that input from multiple vendors and try to get it in an apples to apples way. Because often the offerings are different, and so they need to be able to compare them in a way that is putting them on equal footing, if that makes sense.
And does that happen, like, for example, a lot of companies, a lot of departments, etc., when they are gathering the initial information through an RFI, etc., they engage one entity to actually do the whole requirements gathering and everything, and that party cannot be part of, let's say, they can't themselves be actually the providers of the services eventually as well. Is that the case here as well? Like, for example, you hire a different company for the RFI phase and then eventually award the contract to a different entity. It can't be the same, right?
Right. So oftentimes what we'll see is that government entities will choose consulting firms that do not offer those services themselves. And that is so that they can be able to award to whatever provider they want and not have to preclude a certain provider because that provider offered the consulting services. But you're right. Typically, if a provider provides a consulting type service to do discovery and help them understand what types of services they're looking for, then they're usually precluded from providing that service, who would give them an unfair advantage.
Right. Just to kind of provide a level playing field for all the people who are looking to provide the service, right?
Exactly.
Right. Okay, so let's dive a little bit, I guess, on the telecom side and ask you, like, what exactly is edge computing? I keep on hearing about that.
Edge computing, yeah. So that's a term that's thrown around quite a bit. And to be honest, it's kind of confusing, right? But edge computing arose from some of the constraints of cloud computing. And cloud computing is really just moving your compute resources and storage resources out to somebody else's data center. There's obviously a lot of benefits to the virtualization. It's very scalable, et cetera. However, it's often further away from the users. So, for instance, if you've got a WAN in Pennsylvania, where I'm located, and all your locations and your users are within Pennsylvania, and suddenly you move your compute to AWS in Washington, D.C., you're introducing more latency or round trip time for that user to talk to the server. And so as we have applications that are more and more time sensitive and operating in real time, that becomes a problem. Sometimes those applications won't work at all. So edge computing is really, I like to call it the cloud, but closer. So I think I'm really clever coming up with that. But really what edge computing is just moving some of those compute resources closer to the users. So sometimes that means it's in a POP nearby. Sometimes it actually could be on-prem, which is kind of funny. And then in some instances, it's actually on the receiving device. So an example that I read about, which is really amazing, I think, are the large wind turbines, right? And they have all these weather sensors, right, on them. And one company chose to attach edge computing devices directly onto the wind turbines to do the compute right there. So typically it is a smaller implementation though, obviously, right? So it's not going to have the compute power of an AWS, right? So you're only going to move certain functions to the edge. So it's not a competitive product with cloud computing. They work together.
Right. And so related to the cloud, now that we're talking about the cloud, have you experienced, like, for example, any change in the requirement for, let's say, cloud technologies in general after COVID, given that everything became about being able to kind of work remotely and everything? So on the infrastructure side, how did COVID affect these services, especially related to cloud and edge computing and all of these things?
Well, I mean, to some degree, it forced organizations to move at least some functionality to cloud environments. And I think those organizations, might have been 5 years out, right, from doing that. They would have eventually gotten there, but they weren't necessarily at that point where they needed to or where they were comfortable with it yet. But moving just simple authentication, right? Even so, like Azure has quite a bit of authentication capabilities, right? So moving some of that stuff into the Azure environment. and other compute resources that are more easily accessed by remote users, right? So we've seen a little bit of that. So it kind of accelerated cloud adoption to a degree. And it actually then ended up prompting more ZTNA, or zero trust network access, and even SD-WAN implementation, because organizations needed to allow remote users to connect directly to the cloud instead of entering their WAN and then exiting through their centralized security stack. So
Right.
we've seen those changes, yeah, based on COVID.
Right. And especially on the services, the reason I asked was because obviously on the services side, as software development companies experienced a humongous amounts of requirement around, let's say, resources that could work remotely. Before COVID, people were ready to save some cost and everything where you work. As a result of that, there was a huge demand in the resources that could work remotely, regardless whether they were working remotely in the US, or regardless whether they were working remotely from Europe or Asia, wherever. So there was definitely a huge demand there. So let's move on. So you mentioned about AWS and all of these services. So on the infrastructure side, how does that really affect whether you have to support, let's say, AWS cloud, or you have to support Azure versus Google Cloud? How does that really kind of differ on the infrastructure side?
So really what we see is that organizations are choosing their cloud service provider based on somewhat on their familiarity with it, based on which it ends up being, you know, what their staff is familiar with, right, and trained in. Also, you know, typically Microsoft shops will end up putting some sort of services in Azure, right? AWS, though, obviously was the leader. So they've reached out to many organizations and taken it upon themselves to familiarize those organizations. As far as the infrastructure and network connectivity, we are starting to see organizations at least looking at multi-cloud environments. It's still at a point where many of them are not comfortable or ready to go there, but they do have reasons where they may want to consider multi-cloud. Some of that is availability. Some of that has to do with certain cloud providers experiencing major outages, not to name any names, but it happens, right? And whether they believe that to be solvable by going to a multi-cloud, you know, whether that's true or not, there is that perception out there that a multi-cloud environment is more redundant. So, right. Yeah. So from a connectivity standpoint, it's incumbent on network providers to be able to have large network connectivity to as many data centers as possible, right? And to be able to turn up those connections quickly, as close to real time as possible, right? So right. That's something that Lumen has done. We're not the only provider that does that, but and we all have our own names. Most of them are Cloud Connect or something, something along those lines. So it gets right. A little confusing, but
right. Right. And so when it comes to overlaps between, like, obviously, I think these two industries, they go hand in hand, because I think the telecom sector is the foundation on which you provide all of these services. Like, for example, a lot of applications that are VoIP and everything are, at the end of the day, leveraging the telecom networks there as well, in one form or another. So which areas do fall into the telecom realm versus which areas do fall into the software kind of the IT industry field? I mean, in terms of, I mean, we keep on hearing different areas of the technology space, like, for example, cybersecurity. We talk about infrastructure, we talk about professional services, we talk about managed services. So what exactly is the defining line? Okay, this is related to telecom, this is related to information technology. How do you differentiate between the two?
So yeah, the lines are starting to blur a lot, right? Because traditional telecom companies, we used to just do telephone lines and then, WAN connectivity and internet, right? And that was what we sold. But now that's a commodity. Everybody can do that, right? To varying degrees. There are different tiers of providers, right? You're going to have better service with. But that being said, those services are a commodity, right? So most telecom providers, traditional telecom providers, are shifting their model to start to bring in IT services. And what we mean by IT services is typically related to applications, whether that's, application development, management of application environments, right? And usually IT infrastructure. So that can be at a client's data center. It could be hosted in the telecom providers. Most telecom providers have large data centers. So we host clients in infrastructure or even cloud, right? So most providers are starting to provide more of a comprehensive, well-rounded offerings, right? And that makes sense as the workforce is seeming to dwindle somewhat. I don't know, but it seems most organizations are understaffed to a degree, and especially IT and networking departments. So,
Right.
And then cybersecurity, obviously, that's a little more cut and dried. But as we're seeing shifts in the cybersecurity architectures and networking architectures, they're actually starting to shift or integrate more, right? We're seeing security built into the network topology more and more.
Right. I think at the end of the day now, you're absolutely right. Lines are merging, and it's more kind of a collaborative effort as these industries are kind of merging. And I remember, coming long ago, I was working with this telecom company, and I noticed that we were working with this service provider of cellular services provider actually, and they had their telecom towers, and in which they had equipments coming in from ZTE, they had equipments from Huawei, they had equipments from Siemens and Nokia and all of these companies leveraging. It was like tag teaming along. And then the company that was implementing or managing those services was an entirely different company as compared to the ones that were installing the new equipment. And then the hardware was coming from another side, the software installation teams were a different company. So all of these companies are now tagging team to basically essentially provide all of these services. But thank you so much, Janet, for taking the time for this podcast, and it was wonderful having you here.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.